Good morning. I'm very excited to be here. God, we are so lucky to live in a place like this, aren't we? Yes. Oh. And one of the many things I will say today is that Santa Rosa is really the beginning of the resurgence of the women's history movement. And what I'd like to talk about today is how that happened, why it happened, and most importantly, why it's important. I was going to show the video we're going to see at the end, kind of as a finale, but we've switched that around. So instead what I'd like to do is like to spend the first 10 minutes or so talking about my history and how I discovered women's history and what is women's history and why, most importantly, why should you care? What difference does it make? And then I'm going to ask you to watch a video, and then we'll go on. We'll talk about some women, some specific women. When I realized the topic was women in American history, I thought, oh my goodness, do we have a lifetime? And then I would only be just beginning anyway. So I'm going to give you a few women, maybe tell you a few things you might not have known about them, and then talk about the American history and the movements of American history and how pivotal women have been in them. And then you're going to ask me a ton of questions, and hopefully I'm going to be able to answer some of them. Okay? My experience is very unusual in the fact that I grew up in a very working class family. I'm the youngest of 9 children. I thought that every woman got married, had 9 children, and lived happily ever after. That was the whole world that I had ever known, and that was my assumption. As it turns out, not only did I have my mother as a role model, but my older sister has 10 children, and I'll just cut to the chase and say I have 35 nieces and nephews. So I just assumed that that's what life was, and it was a good life. It was a fun life. Also, it involved growing up in the 60s, assuming that someday my prince would come. And for all the men in this audience, that means that you would have the pleasure, actually the privilege, of somehow coming and making my life important, valuable. You would take care of me. Because my Cinderella myth was, that was just the reality of how things were. So also I should say that my parents had 2 families in some way, my same parents, but my sister is 25 years older than I am, so I had this whole spectrum of history. And I graduated from high school in 1964, and in 1964, we'll talk about some of the things that were still legal, which changed my life. In 1964, most of my friends went off to college, but I was female. Why would I go to college? I was going to get married and have children and be happy. Why would I? College wasn't even anything that was in my vocabulary at the time. So I went to work at the Bank of America with all these really old people. I mean, these folks were 30 and older. It was oppressive. It was awful. I was 18. I was waiting. Where was that prince? Come here. I don't want to keep this job. Anyway, I took a class. I was taking a banking class with a friend of mine who had become my friend. We had started working the same day, doing the same job, and we're coming home from this class this night. His name's Ed, and Ed said to me, Molly, how do you live on $400 a month? And I said, $400 a month? I don't make $400 a month. I make $285. What are you talking about? He said, oh no, Molly, we make $400 a month. Oh my God, I was so happy. I was ecstatic. It was the first time I'd ever been excited about going to work the next day. I couldn't wait to get there. I went to work. I went right up to the bank manager. I said, I need to talk with you. I said, do you know that Ed makes $400 a month? Now this was the beginning of what became a history of faux pas on my part. Most of them unintentional, but as I got older, some of them were more or less intentional. You're never supposed to discuss what your colleagues make. You know, shh, no. So first of all, I floored him with that. And he said, I know that, Molly. And I said, but I only make $285. And he said, I know that, Molly. Well, I didn't know words like condescension, sexism. That was a vocabulary I didn't know anything about. And so I was startled. And I said to him, well, but wait, Ed and I are doing the same job. And he said, yes, Molly, but Ed's on a training program. And I said, oh, fine. Sign me up for that training program. The truth be known, I didn't really want a career with the Bank of America, but I wanted that $400. At which point, and I haven't mentioned this, but I went to Catholic school for the first 9 years of my life. This becomes relevant in a moment. Because at that moment in time, he walked me over to one of those great big brown banker desks. You know, they still have them in the bank. And he looked at me and he said, "Molly, do you think people want to walk into a bank and see women in positions of authority?" And I looked at him startled, and I thought about Sister Mary Carla, Sister Mary Margaret Jones, Sister Mary Grace Michelle, Sister Mary Beatrice. I thought about my sisters and my mothers, and I thought, well, this man's just ignorant. I mean, he's just stupid. So, you know, Lily Ledbetter feels the same way today, because here we are 40 years later and we're still bringing up this issue of equal pay for equal work. But now it's illegal. In 1964, he said that to me, and it wasn't illegal. Well, it was the greatest thing that happened, because I decided, well, never mind with this. If I'm going to have to work, I'm going to work at a job where I'm going to get equal pay with men, because I'm an American. I mean, things need to be free. I mean, fair. I mean, that's the basis of our culture and our society. So I went back to school to get my teaching degree, so that I made up for the fact that I hadn't paid as much attention in high school as I should have. Thank God I grew up in California, was able to go to the community college system that just, you know, swept me up and finally into the university. And I was on my way, and now I knew what learning was, and I was excited as could be. History was my great passion. I was going to become the greatest history teacher ever. I was going to encourage my students to really think, to care, to be involved, to understand what it meant to live in a democracy. I was going to do it, and I was going to do it better than anybody had done it before. Well, luckily, I did get a job teaching high school right out of college, and it was my second year of teaching in 1972. This is my 40th anniversary of my discovery of women's history. 1972. Okay, I won't give you a quiz yet on 1972, but I will give you some of the highlights of 1972. In 1972, Shirley Chisholm runs for President of the United States. Barbara Jordan is elected as the first African-American woman since Reconstruction to be elected in a southern state. Our country is in change. There is no question about it. Title IX of the Education Codes was drafted in 1972, which said you can't have separate but equal facilities for boys and girls. You have to have equal opportunity. It was a banner year. And the Equal Rights Amendment passed Congress. The Equal Rights Amendment was going to guarantee equal opportunity for women. No problem. 1972, we were all feeling it, you know. 8 states rushed to ratify it. It was soon going to be part of the Constitution. I'm a social studies teacher. I'm telling you this about 1972. If I had only known it then, but that's another story. The last thing this kid in 1972 happened, which is where the question that changed my life came from. In 1972, Ms. Magazine was published. And what did it say on the cover? Something like, "What do women want?" 1972, I'm a second-year social studies. I'm going to be the kind of teacher that encourages my students to think, to really think about the complexities of what it means to be an American, to be a citizen of the 20th century. What does all that mean? So, on Fridays, making my class particularly relevant, a student raises his hand and he says to me, I've already told you all that happened in 1972. He says to me as a second-year social studies teacher, he said, "What is the women's movement?" I looked at this young man with as much intelligence and, you know, courage, I guess, as I possibly could. I looked at the class, and finally, after taking a deep breath, I said, "What a good question! Let's divide into groups and look at that from the perspective of the government. What does the government say about the women's rights movement? And how about religious organizations? Let's develop questions about that. And society, what is society saying about the women's movement?" And then, as if history wasn't my great passion, I turned to my final group and I said, "And I want you to develop some questions about what is the history of the women's rights movement." I was stalling. I was completely stalling. As a second-year teacher, you don't think I could have said to these young people, I don't know. I mean, could I? I was a second-year social studies teacher. So it was Friday. I rushed home to my sacred shrine of history books, and I love history with a passion, as you'll learn today. And there it was, one book, one chapter. The book was called, one of my history books was called Freedom's Ferment on the History of the United States, and in it was a whole chapter on the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. In 1848, these brave women and men gathered, 300 of them, in upstate New York in Seneca Falls to challenge the very basis of, in some ways, the Declaration of Independence, because Elizabeth Cady Stanton rewrote it and said that all men and women were created equal. They came up with platforms of ways that women needed to fight for their equality, because remember, at this time, women, once a woman became married, she was legally dead, which meant not only did she have no rights, but she didn't have custody rights to her own children. I mean, the list is long, very, very long. And these women, in this moment in time, in 1848, were willing to challenge it, and of course be totally discounted as being wacko for doing it. But it was because they did that in 1848 that I, as a young married woman in 1972, was able to stand before a high school class in slacks and talk about anything. It used to be called promiscuous if you ever talked with men and women in the same audience. I mean, the life I had, and I'm looking at 1848. I highlighted the whole thing in yellow. I know I got an A on the test. I got straight A's in history. So for me, it wasn't that I didn't know this information at one time. It was that I hadn't incorporated it into my own life. I hadn't cared enough. And that's when it really happened. Because it wasn't really about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and these other women who fought the women's rights movement. It was about the fact that I didn't know the history of my own mother. I was, at this point in my life, 24 years old. My mother had died when I was 21, and I would never get to ask her about the things of her life, because she was my mother. We're going to celebrate Mother's Day next week, right? Mothers are mothers. My mother was born in 1904. She came of age as a flapper. She always told me when I'd ask her how young she was when she got married, she'd say, too young. I had 3 children before I was 21, Molly. Too young, but she would never actually tell me the details. As it turns out, my mother was 24 years old. She had 4 children. She was pregnant for her 5th. My father contracted tuberculosis. So as a 24-year-old woman, mother of 4, she had to buy a car, learn to drive, sell their house in Pittsburgh, because that's where my family lived, as my father was sent to California on a sealed railroad car because TB was considered a death sentence, but also it was so contagious. And my mother just did it. That was the mother I grew up with. That was the mother that was the constant model of my life. My mother's the constant phrase was, circumstances alter cases. Yeah, you betcha they do. And what she was saying is, things change, you just make the most of them. Would I love to be able to write a book, to give the tribute of who my mother was, not only to me, but I have 8 brothers and sisters. My father luckily did not die from tuberculosis. He was able to eventually build 2 businesses that my mother helped him run. It's an amazing story. But it's my story. It's like you all have these amazing stories in our lives. We just don't think about what it takes for people to do what they're doing. So my life since that time, 40 years ago, has really been dedicated to encouraging people to ask new questions. When I went back to that classroom, I owned it to the kids. I said, okay, the truth is when you asked me what is the women's movement, I didn't know. Shock of all shock that a teacher wouldn't know an answer, right? I said, I didn't know. I said, so let's explore that together. And from now on, when we talk about any of these chapters in our book, be it the Civil War, Reconstruction, Pioneer Movement, whatever it is, let's ask new questions. Let's ask whatever phrase, whatever time period were studying, and trust me, there were no women mentioned in the textbooks at that time, 72, about that. Let's just ask a whole new series of questions. You know, for instance, did this impact men and women differently? Because sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. We could take the issue of just war and the ways that that impacts people differently. Did it impact cultural groups differently? And so we were on it. That summer I taught the first class in Women in American History. I had 18 boys and 18 girls, because in California, and you're a social studies teacher, you teach 40 kids often at a time. Anyway, 18 boys and 18 girls. Totally changed my life. They took the Declaration of Seneca Falls, which I talked about in 1848, and they put it to us. At that time we had visual makers, and they juxtaposed those issues with contemporary issues. It was before the backlash of the women's movement had set in. It was at a time when 18 boys would gladly sign up for a women's history class and think nothing of it, because it was something they didn't know. After that, we've seen in the intervening years an extraordinary backlash of misinformation and people being vilified, and words as disgusting as feminazi coming into our vocabulary. But that's a whole other discussion that we'll get into. So for this morning, now that I've told you about why I'm as passionate as I am, and continue to be about women's history, because every time I learn about a new challenge, a new situation, a new thing that happened, relationships between husbands and wives, and the things that they did for each other that all helped build on the momentum which has helped us create the world we live in today. So I'd like to show you a video that was produced by the National Women's History Project. It's 7.5 minutes. It's music. If you want to clap along, you can. There's a stanza that goes over and over again, and that says, "And it's our turn now to carry it on, and I hope that you'll really consider that. But I also have a mission for you, or an assignment, or how many of you have been teachers? Just as I suspected. So you don't mind this being an assignment. What I'd like you to do as you watch this video, I'm going to talk about some of the women who are in it and some of the movements. But I might not talk about the person that really resonates with you. So as you watch this video, there's two things I'd like you to think about. One, is there one specific woman whose name comes up that you hadn't thought about before? You know, she's somebody new. I'd like to know a little bit more about her. Or is there something that happened that you didn't realize that women were that instrumental in making it happen? And then the last thing is, I'd like you to think about, what is the most surprising aspect after you've watched 7.5 minutes of woman after woman, movement after movement, the 7.5 minutes of U.S. history, that's kind of consolidating it. So those are the three things. A woman, something that happened, and something that's surprising. And if you want to take one of the three, that will be okay with me too. But I'd really like, after I talk, I'd really like to have a context that we can come back to and discuss this together. Okay? Okay, so that's your assignment. And I'm going to walk over here, and I'm just going to click this, and it's just going to go on, and there's going to be no problems whatsoever. All you teachers are laughing. I know why. The history of women hidden from our view.
When you know what they have done, you'll learn what you can do. It's a fine and long tradition, a woven tapestry. Woman after woman, making choices just like me. Some were great and some were good. Some did as they could, and it's our turn now to carry it on, and it's our turn now to carry it on. In the days of revolution, women worked to make us free, but it fields and taught our children human dignity. It's there to find between the lines in women's history. It's a fine and long tradition of woven tapestry. Woman after woman, making choices just like me. Some were great and some were good. Some did as they could, and it's our turn now to carry it on, carry it on. And it's our turn now to carry it on. It was women who insisted on an end to slavery, wrote the books and gave the speeches, and demanded liberty. Black and white, they stood together, for none of them were free. They lived and died between the lines of women's history. It's a fine and long tradition of woven tapestry. Woman after woman, making choices just like me. Some were great and some were good. Some did as they could, and it's our turn now to carry it on, carry it on. And it's our turn now to carry it on. The rights of those who labor, the right to organize, the right to vote and end to war, they challenge their own times. Every cause that touches us today is rooted in their lives. Their deeds you'll see through history, it's there between the lines. It's a fine and long tradition of woven tapestry. Woman after woman, making choices just like me. Some were great and some were good. Some did as they could, and it's our turn now to carry it on, carry it on. And it's our turn now to carry it on. We are following their footsteps as we seek our destiny, as we gaze into the future. It's our past that holds the key. We are wiser, we are stronger, if we keep their memory. Their names you'll find between the lines, their women's history. It's a fine and long tradition of woven tapestry. Woman after woman, making choices just like me.
is always so good to give credit to the people who did so much work to make this possible. So that's just a little bit of an overview, and I was going to wait kind of to the end to take some of those questions, but maybe we should start first by me asking you your response, and then I can go into some specific women and specific causes, because I'd rather get your reaction as it's fresh. So,
Okay.
okay?
Okay. Okay. Let me say that in medical school, I graduated in 50, and there were only 10 females out of the 100 in our medical school class. Today, the majority are female in my medical school. Also, I recall that in the entire country there were no female neurosurgeons till Stanford had one in their residency program. That was in the 50s. Today, as I say, the majority of students in medical school are female. 2 years ago, and I still teach at the residency program, family residency program here at Sutter. Each year, they have 12 new residents. 3 years ago, all 12 were female. Just so happens this year, it's 9 of the 12. But the point is, there's been a tremendous change in medicine as far as equality is concerned. And I thought I'd throw that into the pot.
And can I ask you, why do you think that's happened?
I think we're finally recognizing that females can do the same job in medicine as men had done in the past. And it's just a matter of recognition. And
Okay. Oops. Oh, the screen. Okay. Does somebody want to talk to this? Because I have a few little things I'd like to say about how I think this has. And this is why I believe so much that people make history. You know, when we look at history, these facts and dates and stuff, and I apologize to anybody who's taught history in this class, in this group, but, you know, it is one of the top 5 words in the English language that puts people to sleep. And it's because of the way it's been taught. It's been taught as if it was just, you know, this happened. You know, these men who stormed the beaches and died for the Second World War, that just happened. Rather than talking about how it happened, why it happened, yes, we're seeing the outcome, but what created that outcome? And I'd like to get back to that unless somebody wants to comment on this, because I have my own theories about this, but somebody, I don't know.
First, I'd like to ask you, which you can answer later, where was Gloria Steinem? Where was, well, several people that...
Oh, that we're not in this...
Yeah. Certainly Gloria was around in 1996. But I would like to ask this question. It is true, and I've read it only in the past year, that there are more women in medical school than men. But I wonder if we look at the statistics 5 years from now or 10 years from now, whether their salaries will ever be commensurate with what men earned in the previous decades.
And we can talk about that too, because there's new research about that. But I want to get back to how this happened, if people are willing to stay with this one question for a minute.
I'm not certain about this, but I suspect that the income for doctors has gone down with the insurance and with Medicare, and may not be as attractive to men as a way to earn money. But it is certainly very attractive to women because they've never had a chance to make that kind of money.
Okay, that could be part of it. Mhm.
I have a daughter who went to medical school in 1972. Not only did they have to be as good as men, they had to be better to get in. World War II made a big difference, Jerry. I think that was what caused women to get where they were, because men were not here. And women took jobs that men always took before. I remember my mother never worked, but during World War II, she got a job. And it wasn't a shame in those days. Before that, women were ashamed to go, many times ashamed to go to work because their husbands weren't good providers, supposedly. After World War II, I think many things changed.
Well, let me just give a little historic perspective, and then we'll get right back to this question. Because I've already confessed, history is my passion. And when you just mentioned World War II, I'd like to start it from there. You are absolutely correct that there are more women in college today than there were, when there were even 5 years ago. Certainly when I graduated from high school in 1964, that wasn't the idea. And also when I graduated from high school in 1964, something I didn't know, but my Jewish friends were not allowed to go to Stanford because there were quotas. So I mean, we're talking about a different time in our history. So what has changed? Let's just start with the Second World War. With the Second World War, we needed women to fulfill all the jobs that men were overseas fighting, and that's where we get the whole Rosie the Riveter coming into the workforce and doing jobs that, oh my God, just a little while ago it would have been too delicate for me, but oh, hey, give me that welder and let's see what we can get done. I mean, women had to overcome, and so did our culture in general, these assumptions about what it meant to be male and what it meant to be female. But after Rosie's, when the men came back to fill those jobs, women were let go, sometimes willingly, but not so much. You know, when you go from making, let's say, I'll just make up a number, but $2 an hour to making 10 cents an hour, you really don't want to give up those jobs. So a lot of the foment that comes for changing these ideas about women come from this generation of Rosies. Many of them were active during the Kennedy administration when Kennedy convened this commission on the status of women that was headed up by Eleanor Roosevelt. Because remember, we had a lot of powerful women. Frances Perkins, who I hope I'll be able to talk with if I can fight the clock enough later. I mean, we have a whole generation of individual women, but as this idea about who women are and what they were, that takes legislation. You know, you talk about how ideas change and stuff like that, and people are not ready for that. Well, usually, if there's a law that's passed, you have to, you know, you could go to jail. For instance, today, someone couldn't walk up to me and say, oh, honey, nobody wants to see a woman behind a big banker's desk. That's illegal. It wasn't illegal in 1964. So these women, these Rosies, came forward with the Commission on the Status of Women, with the President's Commission on the Status of Women. But the President's Commission on the Status of Women soon learned that they were more of a bureaucracy and a more of, oh, well, that's a sweet idea, honey. That's good. Yeah, maybe we'll try that. And it was one of the things that radicalized them. So this is the formation of the National Organization for Women that was chaired by people like Pauline Murray, who was an African-American. She comes down to us in history as the first African-American woman to be ordained as a bishop. But she was one of these people that said, hey, we need an organization for women like we have the NAACP. Pauline Murray, Betty Friedan, Steinem, all these women who, these are all new ideas. You know, people were thinking about them. They were working on them. And with that comes a new civil rights legislation. The first civil rights legislation didn't protect women in jobs. The EEOC was kind of seen as a joke. You know, it's like, okay. So stewardesses, you know, maybe they can gain 5 pounds or whatever. It was all a cultural issue that was evolving and changing. But the law is what changed it. And in 1972, when Title IX is enacted, is written to be enacted in 1977, the whole world changed. And I say that quite dramatically because in one generation, it transformed the whole field of education. Before 1972, and before the enactment of Title IX, it was completely okay and accepted and thought to be just normal that girls would play basketball in the little gym and the boys would play in the big gym, because who'd want to go see girls play ball? Now, sports is not even written into Title IX. It's not even there. And yet it becomes kind of the target point. And in some ways it should be, because of the skills we learn in sports, because the attitudes we have about women who play sports, the attitude we have about women in strength. But what this also meant was that my friends who in high school couldn't take drafting classes because the teachers say, oh, you want to take drafting because you want to be around those boys. I understand, you don't really need drafting. Well, excuse me, but I might really need drafting, huh, Sonny? It might be one of those things I need. The idea the girls couldn't I love this one. Girls were not good in geometry because they weren't good with spatial dynamics and dimensions and stuff. Have you ever seen the history of women in quilting? I mean, come on. But these were the assumptions, and I was one of them. When I was in high school, I scored, because I'd gone to Catholic school for 8 years before I finally was free at last in public school, which meant that I had a lot of fun but didn't do what the nuns had made me do. I scored 99 percentile on my math scores. Because one of the things about Catholic school, you learn to test really well. I mean, I'm smart. I am smart. I admit that. But I also test really well, too. There are lots of people who are smart that don't test that well. I test very well. I test 99 on my percentile in math. And you take those little scores around to the teachers so they can say, wow, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing in this class? Well, I was not doing well in geometry because you had to do homework. At that time, you had to memorize those postulates and theorems and stuff like that. And I was doing other things. And so my math teacher looks at it. My cumulative score was 97. My score in math was 99. And he looks at me and says, I'll never believe another test score. Now, I cannot blame him for the fact that I did not continue in math and science. I mean, I don't blame any single person. But there was a cultural attitude of what girls could do and what boys could do. And then, of course, no man in this room ever needed to have homemaking or any kind of skills like that, because, of course, somebody else was always going to cook for you. So it was revolutionary when they started doing this bachelor living kind of thing, to really give boys a sense of what it means to take care of yourself. And I'm looking for a prince because he's going to come along and take care of me, and I'm sure there's some man who's looking for a princess who's going to come along and take care of him. In my case, he would have been out of luck because I don't cook. But, so Title IX, the passage of Title IX, which was spearheaded in large part by a whole group of women in Congress, primarily Patsy Mink, who was the first woman of color elected to Congress, period. She represented the state of Hawaii, and since this time she's passed. But now the Title IX Code is called the Patsy Mink Code. Not ever because one person does it. No matter what's achieved, it's never one person that does it. That person can take the leadership, that person can have the grit, that person can have the gumption, persistence, and sometimes, drive you crazy. But it's a collective thing. All these movements that we're talking about, it's because people come together. The United States of America, my God, do we have example after example. So when you talk about women in college today, yeah, because Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman doctor, right? It was a joke. She got admitted to medical school because the boys that voted her in, that she could, be able to come, they did it almost as a way to embarrass their faculty. And then their faculty was, caught in between a rock and a hard place. That's how Elizabeth Blackwell got into school. And my God, of course they couldn't let women look at human bodies. Bad enough they looked at cows and stuff like that. So the attitudes, our cultural assumptions are the things that have propelled the history forward. But it has always been because we've had the power of the law behind us. Laws matter. and they matter because people come together to generate these laws. I mean, this whole talk about regulation today is just in some ways borderline absurd. I mean, let's look at them. Let's not just dismiss them. Oh my God, that's a law, it's got to be bad. Oh my God, that's a regulation, it's got to be bad. Let's look at what it entails. What does it provide for? But Title IX, and this is, I feel, I can sing this. This is the 40th anniversary. And this is the 40th anniversary. My niece plays basketball. Of course, she's 6 feet tall. She plays basketball. So when she started playing basketball, she was, I think she was in the 8th grade. And before that, she played softball. And when she got into basketball, it was like, how sometimes you just find your niche. She really wants to be an artist, and she's smart enough to know that she's not going to play in the WNBA. But hopefully she'll get to go to school on a athletic scholarship. So we're sitting around the table, and the NBA, I don't know how long ago it was, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the NBA had just changed the rules so that a young man couldn't go right out of college, right out of high school and play professional sports. He had to have at least 1 year of college. And so Jada says to me, so Aunt Molly, how many years does a girl have to have? And I said, 4, she has to graduate. And my niece says to me, and I just love this, she says to me, with all her indignance, she says, that's not fair. And I'm thinking, oh my God, would I have thought that was not fair? No. If when I was her age, I would have thought, that's just the way it is. I had thought, oh child, you have so much to learn about the future. I said, but I think it's a good idea, Jada, because isn't it more important that you graduate from high school? Now the older she's got, she's going to be a senior next year. She realizes a lot more about the world and about whether or not regulations are fair or not fair. But 40 years ago, she couldn't have asked that question. 20 years ago, she might not have either. Title IX has manifested itself probably more in the fields of science and math than anything else. It's just that because sports are such a profit part of university systems, it's part of why they have achieved as much notoriety as they have. When I was in high school, we had homecoming queens. I think every high school still does have homecoming queens, right? But when I was in high school, the football team selected who the nominees for the homecoming queen were, and all the boys in the school voted. When I say that to young boys and girls today, they laugh at me. They can't conceive of it, anything being set up in that kind of structure. And I think that's what I'm trying to say over and over again. Our assumptions have changed, and they're constantly changing. And we need the power of the law behind that helps propel it. At the same time, there were 3 things I wanted to say today, and I see already I'm getting a little carried away. I wanted to say 3 things about women's history in general. Okay, and when I said assumptions, that was one of them. I would like everyone in this room to always assume, I know we're not supposed to assume things, but please, always assume that in any historic time period, women of all cultural groups have made major contributions to that culture and that society at that time. Yes, we might not know their names. They might not have written English. They might have been completely illiterate. They might have been women like Mum Bet. Mum Bet was a woman born into slavery in Massachusetts. She was a slave. She was the men in Massachusetts were writing up the new Declaration for Massachusetts about how all people would be free and stuff like that. She was a contemporary of Abigail Adams. I think she lived in, I'll make up something, in the early 1700s. And so she's cleaning up, and of course, unfortunately, even today, people who are servants are often seen as invisible. But she's listening, and they're talking about how all people are free. All people are to be free under this declaration. So Mumbet runs away and finds a lawyer to help her, a lawyer who takes on her case. Because actually they're writing this thing that all people will be free in the state of Massachusetts. It's because of Mumbet that slavery gets outlawed in Massachusetts. Mumbet, who never learned to read or write, Mumbet, who was lucky enough to get an ally, this wonderful lawyer who, of course, was totally vilified and ostracized by his colleagues for taking on this case. Mumbet, who becomes incorporated into this family, and one of one of the young women is an artist, and that's why we even have an image of Mambet today, whose other name is Elizabeth Friedman. But do we know her? Do we know that? No, we don't know these things. And it's not because it's been necessarily a calculated way of excluding this history. It's just that some things are not seen as that important. So what I ask you is to assume that at any time in our history that women of all cultural groups have made major contributions. At the same time, I am not here to idealize women in any way. Any more than I'm here to idealize my possible ex-princesses. You know, I'm not here to idealize men. I'm not here to idealize women, because as far as I know, we're all human. I told you I was brought up in the Catholic Church, and in the Catholic Church, the only person that was ever purported to be risen into heaven was Mary. And I have always said, unless I see people levitating in their seats, I'm going to assume that there might be some flaws in your history too. So as we talk about these women in history, I think it's important to talk about the complexity of them. So let me just, since I am finding the clock and I really want to talk more with you, let me just take one of the great examples and who's really, really important to know today, and that's Margaret Sanger. Especially this whole discussion around birth control, vaginal probes, women's control of their own body, all of that stuff. Margaret Sanger gets dismissed as a eugenics. She gets dismissed as, this is a way to dismiss her. Oh my God, she was part of the eugenics movement, which meant that she thought that, we should breed people for higher intelligence and all that. Well, I'm sorry to say that Margaret Sanger did have some of those ideas. She was a person of her culture and her time, and so did Alexander Graham Bell, and so did lots of other people. Thank God we live long enough to change and transform ourselves. Margaret Sanger thought that light-skinned black people were smarter than dark-skinned black people. And this brings me to my next thing. Invisibility is the #1 form of bias. What dark-skinned black people do you think Margaret Sanger was ever around? It's like invisibility is the #1 form of bias because we don't know people. I don't know how many of you know people of the Islam faith. I know very few myself. And so the stereotypes that come at us can be frightening and scary. I have friends whose parents were locked up during the internment of the Japanese, and you think, well, how could that happen? Well, how many people? Eleanor Roosevelt, who I will not be able to say enough good things about. She supported Franklin in locking up Japanese American citizens, saying things as stupid as, well, they haven't been here this long. My God, 8 generations isn't enough. But it's all about not knowing people's history. And so as I tell you to please assume that women have made major contributions, at the same time, also assume that these women were flawed. They made mistakes. They did things that we wish they hadn't done. God, they said things that were racist, homophobic, classist. Of course they did. They were people of the time. But when we go back to Margaret Sanger's life was dedicated to motherhood. Her life was dedicated so that mothers could, first of all, could choose to have children, but also choose to have, yes, healthy children, but she never ever believed you should kill a child who wasn't healthy or genetically whatever profound as it's supposed to be. Margaret Sanger's mother had 18 pregnancies in 22 years. Do you think that kind of defined her life? Margaret Sanger worked as a midwife. How many botched abortions did she see? How many repeated botched abortions did she see with a dying woman? She never gave up throughout her entire life. Yes, she made alliances with rich people. And people say, ooh, she went over to the other side, the dark side. Since when is making alliances with people who are rich and can support what you're doing? Why is that going over to any side? That's just helping to get things done that need to get done. And she didn't stop through her entire life. I think she lived to be in her late 80s. I watched this tape once with her, and I was was so surprised because I don't know if it was decapitate. I just know it was in black and white. And she took on the Catholic Church like I just couldn't believe that a woman of her age and her stature would be calling out the church on issues related to contraception and birth control. I mean, come on. As Americans, whether we agree with people or not, we definitely support the kind of power and courage that it takes. Margaret Sanger, throughout her entire life, never gave up on trying to help mothers be able to choose to have children. She's very much involved in the labor movement because of the ways that women were treated, just the constant drudgery of what their lives were like. So, I'm here today, I didn't know I was going to do this, but I'm here today to defend Margaret Sanger. Yeah, she said and did some really things I wish she really hadn't done and said. She lived a very long life, and in that long life, I'm sure she learned different things. I don't know if any of you have ever said anything racist in your life. I don't know if any of you have ever said anything that was homophobic in your life. I don't even know if you've carried some of those ideas in your life, because we're all different. We're all growing. We're all changing. And so I ask you, when specific people, let's take some of the most current people. We could take Gloria Steinem. Somebody mentioned Steinem. We could take Gloria Steinem, for example. I do presentations all around the country with teachers. And I ask them to divide into groups and pick 5 women, and then it gives them a chance to kind of talk about 5 women and then select some of the women. You cannot believe the god-awful things that people say about Gloria Steinem. You wouldn't believe, you would think that she and the devil were really close friends. Gloria Steinem I don't know, I guess all I can say is if any of you have ever heard her speak, or if any of you have ever read anything that she's written, you will discover that Gloria Steinem is one of the most incredibly inclusive people on the planet. Again, I'm not saying Gloria Steinem is perfect, but there isn't anything ugly. She doesn't go ugly on people. She talks about the issues of today. She tells the truth. Now, if the truth is ugly, well, that's a whole other issue. But Gloria Steinem is a prime example how a woman of the 20th century who is so powerful and has such good things to say gets vilified and then ostracized by lies, by things that just aren't true. So I ask you, when any of these women, you leave here today and you say, oh, Molly said such and such, I'm going to go see. Use even Wikipedia. Use about 6 different versions of it. But the whole point is, once you can put people in a box, once you can say, oh, well, what do you expect? She's a Democrat. Or, oh my God, he's a Republican. Or, oh my God, he's a conservative. Or, oh my God, he's pro-choice. Or, oh my God, he's whatever it is. When people start boxing people, and I think women's history, the knowledge of women's history is a way to shatter those boxes, because I think having real content about real people gives us those tools to engage with each other. I'm sure that all of us in here don't agree about lots and lots of things, but I do think that we could sit down, voice to voice and have a conversation about it. So those are the things I wanted to say. I wanted to make sure that you knew that invisibility is the #1 form of bias. When we don't know about people, we don't know what they've done. I have a sister-in-law who I love with all my heart, but if she says to me one more time, those people, I think I'll just scream, because I want to know who those people are. And she lives in somewhat of a very very loving bubble. But because she lives in that bubble, she really does see the world as those people. So, I'm going to let you talk, but I just have to read 2 quotes. Okay. From 2 women who I love just more than I can tell you. The first one is a woman named Margaret Chase Smith. How many of you know who Margaret Chase Smith is?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Margaret Chase Smith she served in the United States Senate as the only woman for 2 decades. They didn't have a restroom for her in the Senate. She was from Maine, and people in Maine like to call themselves maniacs And they really do. They're not being pejorative about it and stuff. They say, we're maniacs. The story of how she got to Congress in the first place is really one of those wonderful networking stories, because before she had been elected, she had been a telephone operator, and that was in the days when the telephone operators used to be able to listen in on all our conversations, but you know, the whole way that networking. Well, she was married to Clyde Smith, who I think he was a congressman for 3 or 4 terms before she ran, and then he died, probably of syphilis, because as Margaret Sanger would openly say, and this is what I mean about her, she'd say things like, well, Clyde Smith liked the women, and the women liked Clyde Smith. So she never said, oh no, my husband never did anything like that. That was her intention. Anyway, she was elected to the United States Senate. Let's see, I guess she was elected in November of 1948. This is when Truman was in the White House, and so she was elected in. So she took office in January of 1954. And so I'm not going to read you her whole speech. I would love for you to consider looking it up on Google or anything. It's called the Declaration of Conscience. And it's one of those speeches that I just don't understand why, when we talk about great speeches in American history, why it's not the speech we study over and over and over again. So Margaret Chase Smith, she'd only been elected in January, and this is in June. 6 months later, she was up to here with McCarthyism and what she was seeing McCarthy do to this country, the way it was being divided. She tried to lobby her colleagues to fight McCarthyism, and the Republicans said, no, he's really helping us get those Dems, and the Dems would say, oh no, oh my God, no, people call me a communist. Cowards all the way around, except for 8 of her fellow Republican senators. So she comes into the U.S. Senate to give this speech, and I'll just start it, and I'll tell you what happens after these first 3 paragraphs. She says, Mr. President, I'd like to speak briefly and simply about a serious national condition. It's a national feeling of fear and frustration that could result in national suicide and the end of everything that we Americans hold dear. In a condition that comes from It is a condition that comes from a lack of effective leadership in either the legislative branch or the executive branch of the government. That leadership is so lacking that nervous and responsible proposals are being made that national advisory commissions be appointed to provide such critical, needed leadership. I speak as briefly as possible because too much harm has already been done with irresponsible words of bitterness and selfish political opportunism. I speak as briefly as possible because the issue is too great to be obscured by eloquence. I speak simply and briefly in the hope that my words will be taken to heart. I speak as a Republican. I speak as a woman. I speak as a United States Senator. I speak as an American. At which point, most of the United States Senate, including Joseph McCarthy, got up and left the Senate, leaving her to go on to finish her speech. She went on, and I'm skipping, but she said, and I want to say that anyway she was leaving, as she's going through this, she wasn't leaving Truman off the hook either. She was just looking at what our government was doing, Republican, Democrat, across the board. She said, those of us who shout the loudest about Americanism in making character assassinations are too frequently those who, by their own words and actions, ignore some of the basic principles of Americanism. The right to criticize, the right to hold on popular beliefs, the right to protest, the right of independent thought. The exercise of these rights should not cost one single American citizen his reputation or his right to a livelihood, nor should he be in danger of losing his reputation or livelihood because he happens to know someone who holds on popular beliefs. Who of us doesn't? Otherwise, none of us could call our souls our own. Otherwise, thought control would have set in. So, that was Margaret Chase Smith. She was, yes, let's hear it from Margaret Chasen. She says a lot more. It's a 15-minute speech, but it's a 15-minute speech that we should all grow up knowing. And when people talk about the downfall of McCarthyism, which didn't come for another 2 or 3 years, Margaret Chase Smith's name isn't even mentioned. It's like what happened at the end, not what happened at the beginning. Again, it's not because people are trying to write women out of history. It's because they didn't understand the significance of that moment. And I guess that's what I'm asking for. I'm not going to read anything that Eleanor wrote, but I do want to say one more thing about Eleanor Roosevelt, who, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the great citizens of the 20th century, male, female, the whole gamut. And that's the work that she did on the international human rights, the Declaration of International Human Rights in the UN. More often than not, Eleanor even gets portrayed as poor, long-suffering Eleanor. Oh, please. I'm telling you, she had tough times. She grew up in a tough family. She grew up in a family that was everything, that she became not incredibly anti-Semitic, racist, classist, one of the richest families in the world. And Eleanor Roosevelt, any woman in the world, any person in the world, shows us that people get to transform themselves with information. That the more information you get, the more you are able to become who you really want to be. And for Eleanor, it was her connection with other people. She didn't ever enter into a conversation with people she didn't walk away learning from. I did a whole thing in 1984. I traveled around the country talking about Eleanor Roosevelt, mostly to library groups and to a lot of older people, like us. And without question, every single place I went, and I must have presented at least 12 to 15 times, there was someone in the audience who had met Eleanor. And you know how Eleanor gets stereotyped? She was very attractive, and she was on. And they'd say to me, Eleanor Roosevelt had the most warm, engaging eyes, and when she spoke to you, you felt like you were the only person in the room. I heard that in California, I heard that in Maine, I heard that in Texas, I heard that everywhere I went. Eleanor Roosevelt, when she talked about the rights, the universal rights of citizens, she was talking about everybody. She was one of our most beautiful, strongest voices. And yes, I know I listened to tapes of hers too, and she has kind of that upper crust clip talk or whatever. So if you don't want to hear her own words, read them. But this is why it's so important that we know about who these women are and what they've done, because we're part of them. The reason that I'm here today is because of Eleanor Roosevelt, because of Shirley Chisholm, because of Mom Bet, because all those women who found the courage to become who they were, and most importantly, because of my mother. Now, my mother, I'm positive, I gave her a quiz on women's history. She would have known about Eleanor, because I have to fess up that in my household, I grew up, my parents had lived through the Depression, so in my household, there was God and Jesus Christ. And they were really kind of, there was God and there was Franklin Roosevelt. They were really pretty close. And then, because I grew up in California after one of Nixon's campaigns, there was the devil, and Richard Nixon was really close by. So I did grow up in a family that was very political, but I don't think either of my parents knew anything about women history other than Eleanor traveled the world during the Second World War to try and, connect with our troops. So those are people I had to speak about today. I want to invite you all to come visit the National Women's History Project via our website. All of you, every year we do a newspaper that focuses on the theme because there's so much to tell, as you can see. There's so much to say that each year we try and focus on a specific concept of women's contribution. And this year, being the 40th anniversary of Title IX, we focused on women's education, women's empowerment. I left copies for everybody. If there's not enough copies, just call me. I'll be glad to send as many more as you want. Our website is throughout this. Also, for those of you that in September would like to see the home of the women's rights, the beginning of the women's rights movement, we're scheduling a bus tour that's going to go from Syracuse to the National Women's Historic Park. So we will see Susan B. Anthony's house. We'll see Harriet Tubman's house. We'll see Elizabeth Cady Stanton's house. We will see the Octon Reservation. It'll be quite fun. So those are all my pitches, because now I want to take it from you, and I just please consider coming to our website or follow up with an email to me. It's really easy. It's just NWHP for National Women's History Project at nwhp.com. And then these are some of the resources, speeches and stuff we do every year, because our goal is to get this information into the schools. The sooner these young people learn about who women are. Abigail Adams, when she wrote to John, in 1776, and he was writing up the Declaration of Independence and developing ideas for this new government, she wrote to him and she said, in the new code of laws, I would ask you to be more generous and favorable to the ladies. If attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws or representation. Now, people have taken that to mean that Eleanor somehow wanted women to be involved in the political sphere. She didn't. The political sphere was Washington. They didn't care. Abigail Adams grew up with her father being a minister and having countless women come to him, battered wives, that had they had nothing to do. There was no safeguard for them. They had to go back to these battering situations. So Abigail goes on to say, all men will be tyrants over women if you let them. So Abigail Adams, from the get-go, is talking about domestic violence. We're talking 1770s, right? And the reason I bring this up now is I really believe with all my heart that if our young people, boys and girls alike, learn about who women are from first grade on or before, for girls, it gives them a stronger sense of purpose, of self, of self-esteem, of this heritage, of this legacy. And for boys, it does the same. For boys, it gives them a whole new respect about who girls are and why they could do it. And I don't need to feel threatened that Susie's better than me at such and such, because women are good at stuff. So that's really been always our goal, to get into the schools, to change the basic assumptions about who women are and why we count. So with that, I think I've left about 10 minutes for questions. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Like this, right? Okay. Yes.
One more pitch, please, for the campaign for the National Women's History Museum.
Okay. The National Women's History Museum, the goal is to have a National Women's History Museum on the Mall in Washington, D.C. And they have, again, an extraordinary website that you can go and visit. And their website is also very easy. It's just NWHM instead of NWHP.org. They've had a lot of difficulty getting this through this Congress, as you might guess, because anything, even though they're not asking for money, anything that has to do with the authorization, people get nervous that means you might ask for money down the line. But again, it's like everything else. The more people that are behind it, the more voices they hear, the more voices our Congress hears. It's up to us. As much as critical as 14% Congress has a 14% rating right now, how many of you have called them recently? It's like they need to hear from all of you. Whatever your perspectives are, in a democracy, the more people that vote, the more people that are heard, the better the democracy is going to be. So that's what I would say about the National History Museum.
Do you think the ultimate glass ceiling of a woman being elected President of the United States will occur soon? Or do you think it's not necessary that it will be a bottom-up? Who might those people be that might be shattering that glass ceiling?
Well, I actually think that Hillary Clinton shattered that glass ceiling in a very fundamental way with her campaign against President Obama. And the reason I say that is because we've had several women who have run for president before Hillary. Not only Shirley Chisholm, Victoria Woodhull, Margaret Chase Smith. We've had a cadre of women who have run for president before. But for Hillary, it was neck and neck. And so young people growing up, It's kind of like when Gerald, I'll go back a little bit, when Geraldine Ferraro was nominated for Vice President of the United States, I was with a colleague of mine and her husband called and said, turn on the TV, you know, the Dems are going to nominate Geraldine Ferraro. And I said, in my mother's vernacular, I said, oh yeah, a pig's ear. Because to me it was too foreign. But see, for kids growing up now, we've had 2 women who have been nominated for Vice President. We've had a woman who was almost elected as the candidate for her party. It was a real campaign. And so I think that Hillary has done an amazing job. Well, and then we've had 3 women secretaries of state, you know, from Albright to Condoleezza Rice to Hillary. So I think, and the reason I'm saying this is these kids growing up, they're not limited by the same assumptions we had when we were their age. We know this is possible. Who these women might be and how they might come to be is going to be a whole other story. I don't know, because money is such a huge part of getting anybody elected to anything. So, you know, but maybe as a grassroots movement we'll stop that from happening. Maybe we will curtail that. Maybe we'll say enough is enough. I don't know, but I do know that more and more we have these stellar role models who step forward from very different perspectives. But still, for kids, like let's take my niece Jada. You ask her that question, she'd say, oh yeah, eventually. I mean, she'd never think, she wouldn't think that it's not possible. And of course, when I was growing up, of course, did I ever think I'd see an African-American president? Not a chance either. So also, and I'm glad you said that, because one of the things we need to remember is we're living at the speed of light. I mean, things are changing that quickly, and that's part of what's so terrifying and why some people are becoming, you know, scared, shall we say. But yeah, I don't think there's any question. It will just depend upon, you know, how they work it as these parties work their stuff. I mean, did we ever think we'd see a campaign like we've seen this year? Did any of you ever think that contraception would be an issue in 2012? I mean, really? So, you know, I really don't know, and I think that's why I talked about Margaret Sanger today, because the whole idea of, I have watched men, of course I have to say it was on the Daily Show, because, you know, Jon Stewart likes to present these different corresponding things, but I heard this man who was an elected official in one of the states, I think it was Oklahoma, but I'm not positive. One of his state legislatures, a woman, had said that she thought that as long as conception, because the issue was whether or not conception was as soon as the zygote was formed, you know, as soon as sperm and egg were united, then that was birth, and that was a person, and that was that personhood amendment. And she said, well, I think we need to go farther than that. I think we should say that the sperm is sacred, and so the only way that a sperm can be used is, you know, to impregnate a woman. And she introduced this in the House. I don't mean to be shocking, but anyway, what was so interesting for me is this man said, this is really how he felt. He said, well, that would be the government trying to control a man's body. he said that. I mean, and you know what? He was right. But so that's what I mean about the dialogue that needs to take place, the conversations we need to have. And you know what Margaret Chase Smith wrote and said at that time about McCarthyism. I'm not saying that we're back on the advent of McCarthyism, although we do know we have a congressman who said that, you know, the Progressive Caucus were a bunch of communists. That word is just thrown around like it means something. But we are at a time when we are so incredibly polarized, as we're Americans. You know, we are Americans. And those of you who are not in the room are not Americans, that's okay. You're citizens of the world. I mean, you know, as people. And so for me, and this is where I would love all of you to read Steinle's books, because what she starts with in almost every chapter is a story about somebody, you know, somebody's life in a particular way that draws you in, that makes you feel connected, that makes us feel universal, that we're all part of the same team. We might have different strategies, you know, but is there anybody in this room that doesn't want the world to be better? And so that's what I think we have to keep remembering. Okay.
We'd like to thank Molly for coming. This hour just went by so quickly. Thank you, Molly, for coming.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
Paul. Thank you.
Happy Mother's Day next week. We'll see you in 2 weeks.